Brothers and sisters, I just want to thank you for allowing me to be here today, and I want to thank Monsignor Cihak for inviting me. It's really a great opportunity because Monsignor has been a mentor of mine, and as he said, I got to celebrate. This is like my first mini assignment before my real assignment, and so it's really great to be with all of you here today. So, as the vocations director, I have a couple of stories to tell you today, and one of them is a little, just a snippet of my own vocation story, just as of recently, as my life as a priest, but it's kind of a Christmas story, so I'm going to start there today. So, the other assignment that I had been given about a year ago was Archbishop Sample asked me to be a military chaplain for the Air Force. So some of you know that there's an Air Force base right next to PDX Airport. If you've ever flown out of Alaska, you often face and see some F-15 fighter jets out there. And so that's the base where I am, usually one weekend per month and some other weekends as well. But while I was there, I have some unique opportunities to serve the Catholics that are there. And one of those opportunities happened over Christmas time. And in fact, when we talk about vocations in the first place, we have to remember what that word means, right? That word vocation or vocare means to call, right? So my primary job really is helping other men discern whether or not Jesus is calling them to the priesthood. But they often call something like the military chaplaincy a call within a call. And as Monsignor knows all too well, sometimes we think we're going to be parish priests, and then we get some other call within the call, and then they send us other places and stuff. And so that's kind of this experience. So it was Christmas Day, just this past year. And I had celebrated the night before the Christmas Eve Mass for the sisters at Our Lady of Peace Retreat House. I'm sure many of you have been there before. And then, because I don't have my own parish, I'm usually filling in and helping out, and nobody needed me to fill in on that Christmas day. And so my immediate family lives in Texas. So I thought, you know what? I think I could probably get a flight on Christmas Day and go there and see my family. It's rare that a priest gets to do that anyway, unless your family is local. But if you guys remember what Christmas weather was like, well, my flight got canceled around with about 6,000 other people out there. And so it was kind of a huge bummer, right? Because my whole plan sort of was contingent on that. And so I FaceTimed my mom, and she was just so sad. And, and of course, she also cooked enough food as if 5 of me were coming home, right? As you know, and so she was just really bummed now, all this food, and I wasn't going to get to come home. So it was kind of like a sad little Christmas morning, so it started. And then I got a call from one of the commanders at another base that's kind of yoked to this one, the 116th Air Control Squadron, and that's in Warrenton, right near Seaside in Astoria. And the commander there's a Catholic, and he called me and he said, "Father Peter, can you come to the hospital in Vancouver?" And I said, "Actually, I can. I should be on a plane right now, but I can come to the hospital." And so what had happened is one young airman, only 20 years old, he had seen somebody who'd gotten in an accident and was on the side of the road. And so he stopped along with another Good Samaritan. And when they were outside of their cars, they got hit by another car. And so now this airman was lying there in the hospital, with a respirator, and they didn't know if he was going to make it until the next day. And so it illustrates an important point, that sometimes we feel we have our own little pity parties every once in a while for the difficulties that we have, but then we see our neighbor, our friend, sometimes somebody we've never even met yet, and we see their situation. We turn things outward, not inward. And it gives us perspective on our own difficulties and struggles. And as I entered the hospital room that day, and I saw a mother and a son there on Christmas Day, it really put my Christmas into perspective. It kind of changed a lot of the ways that I was feeling sorry for myself that morning. And then as I got into conversation with them, I found out that that this woman had lived in Rome for a time because she was married to somebody who was in the Italian Air Force. And wouldn't you know it, as we got in conversation, she said, "One time I was living in Rome and I was going through a very difficult time. And I happened to meet a priest from back home, from the Archdiocese, Monsignor John Cihak." And so there we are in the hospital, never having met. And then we have this other person in common. And it speaks vocationally to what the priesthood is, being radically available to the other person. And I had realized my brother priest had already helped her at a different time in life, in a different journey in life. But at that moment, as I was standing there, I learned that they were Catholic. And I said, ma'am, can I anoint your son? And she said, oh, Father, please anoint him. And so that day, that would have been enough for me, brothers and sisters, because that's why I became a priest, to be there for the people of God. And I called my mom on my way back home that morning, and I said, Mom, I think I know why at least I missed my flight this morning. And then something else happened. I realized now I don't have a whole group of people to celebrate Mass for. It's Christmas Day. Like, what am I going to do with myself? And so I called the commander at the base here, and another Catholic man. And he was there because he was on what they call alert status. So the main mission of that base over there is that they have 2 F-15s fully ready to go, 2 pilots, and a crew to get them in the air in about less than 10 minutes. And while we were there, they, it was an example of leadership. The whole day was an example of servant sacrificial leadership to me. When we were back to go to the hospital, when we were at the hospital, not only was the commander of the other squadron there, but then also the 1-star general, who's over all of the guard here, also came on her Christmas Day to be there with that airman. And then it was the commander of that base and their other top pilot. They said, we take Christmas Day shift because we're the ones in charge. And so I called and I said, sir, I need to celebrate Mass still for Christmas, and I know that you don't get to go to Christmas Day Mass either. I said, is there any way I could celebrate Mass? We could do it together. I can offer Mass for you. And he goes, oh, Father, he goes, that would be incredible. He's like, that's one of the biggest hardships of being on alert on a day like Christmas. He's like, can you come out here? And I said, sure, yeah. And so I drove out to the base. And now, those of you who know my background in that whole climbing and mountaineering world also carries over as a priest. I'm sort of known for being the really prepared priest. Like, I have all the kit, right? I have a Mass kit if I'm going to climb a mountain. I have a Mass kit if I'm going to go to somebody's home. I have a Mass kit for an assisted living facility, right? So I just they're like all for different occasions. And so I show up that day with my Mass kit that I often use on the base. And can you believe what the prepared guy forgot? I forgot the hosts. I forgot the bread for the Mass, like the most important thing. And I'm just looking through my stuff and I'm sort of panicking inside. And then I look up, I say, Colonel, I forgot the hosts. I was like, however, there are some hosts in the chapel at the other end of base. Can I go out there and grab them? He's like, oh yeah, sure, Father, go do whatever you got to do. And so there's a World War II era chapel on that base, one of very few that's in existence in the United States anymore. Did I say World War I, World War II? I don't know. Maybe I said World War II. So I went out there on the other end of base, and I opened the doors to the chapel, and I heard a really loud noise, and it sounded to be like static. And I thought, did they leave like the PA system on, or what? What's going on here? And then I got about halfway into the church, and I realized that's water. And then I look in the corner, I see all this standing water. And then I look further around the corner, and I see a pipe that's gushing like a fire hydrant behind the toilet. And then I'm like, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? And that chapel, because it's a guard base, is used maybe 1 weekend per month, if that. So very few people ever walk into that chapel during the week. And so I'm like, well, what do I do? So I took my shoes off. I took my socks off. I'm in my clerics, by the way, and my collar and everything. And I roll my pants up above my knees, and I start wading into the water. And of course, it's freezing, right? Because it's like ice and snow melt. So I walk up there, and of course, the valve is at the very bottom of the left-hand corner of like the toilet in the wall. And now, I'm sure that a modern plumbing, you could probably turn a valve off in like 4 or 5 turns. But a valve from the 1940s takes significantly more turns to get off, just so you know. So I'm turning, I'm thinking, is this thing just spinning or what, And then finally, the flow of water gets down to about like a garden hose. But the water was gushing over my head the entire time I was doing it. So I was completely soaked from the first moment that I bent down to do that. And so I look like a wet rat, and I get in my car, I dry my feet off with a paper towel, put my shoes and socks back on, and I'm in the car, and I call the colonel. I say, Colonel, I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is I have the hosts. The bad news is there's a geyser in the chapel. And so he's like, oh my goodness. So he called the fire department, who was also on call that day. And they went over there and turned the main water supply off to the building. And then they started squeegeeing the water out and then also putting fans in there. We very often in our lives, especially vocationally, we love to make plans. And I'm sure maybe Monsignor has preached this about it. Father John Riccardo talks much about this. We love to draw up the blueprint. And then we say, Lord, look what I have created. If you only follow this, everything should be fine, right? But we know the saying, man plans and God laughs, right? And so we so often want to outline what things are going to look like. And then sometimes things are radically reoriented, right? So that chapel could have been absolutely destroyed that day if I hadn't forgotten to bring those hosts. Many, many times they've tried to bring it down because of lead paint and asbestos, and somehow, some way they mitigate it and then it stands still. But that day it was spared once again. And then as I went over there and I celebrated Mass with the commander that day, I really realized what was truly important. And I thought back to one moment that happened to me when I was under the deluge of the water. So while I was turning that valve, I started to laugh and I started to smile because I said to myself, truly in that moment, I said, I am exactly where I'm supposed to be. And I didn't mean in a World War II era chapel on a military base on Christmas Day. I meant in my vocation. I meant as a priest. I meant for all of the unusual things that happened to me that day. And of course, why did that all happen? Because I needed to celebrate Mass for somebody else that day. You'll see the new Vocations poster out in the back of the church today. And it's actually me. I didn't know that they were going to use me, but they used me. And so there's a picture of me celebrating Mass and elevating the Eucharist. And below my arms, kind of like a triangle, is Mount Hood. And why? Because that host right above the summit of Mount Hood is because the Eucharist is the source and summit of our Christian life. That's why we need a priest in the first place. That's really what we're looking for in the priesthood. We are looking for heroic men that want to be there for the unexpected. Like I said, there are things that had happened to me in my first, this is my going into fifth year of priesthood now, that I never imagined. Guys like Monsignor Cihak would come and talk to us in the seminary, and we'd hear all these stories that they tell us, and we'd be like, that's never going to happen to me. And wouldn't you know it, like your first year of priesthood, it starts happening to you. The way that the Lord allows you to be an instrument for His miracles, for His sacraments in the world. And one of the miracles I got to be a part of that day was the very next morning, that young airman woke up and they took him off the ventilator. In fact, I didn't tell this in any of the other two homilies that I gave here at Christ the King, but it was funny because I knew that he had woken up, but I hadn't seen him again. And then one day I was in the medical unit at the base, and I was sitting there, and there was a woman smiling at me across just in the waiting area. And I looked up and I smiled, and then I was like looking at my phone or something dumb like that, And then I looked up again a couple minutes later, and she smiled at me again. And then I just smiled back. And then I looked up, and I saw his name, his last name, on his uniform. And I stood up like a bolt of lightning, like I stood right up. And I realized it was them from the hospital, the mother and son. I did not even recognize her son because of the way that I saw him when he was lying in that hospital bed. And it was just amazing to see him alive and very much well. It's incredible what the Lord allows the priests to participate in. But here are the two big problems as I see them. So a couple months ago, I was at World Youth Day with the Archbishop and over 40 people, some of which are in this room right now, actually. And it was an incredible and difficult trip for those of you who know anything about World Youth Days. But during that trip, we have all kinds of incredible conversations. But wouldn't you know it, I ran into one of the people that used to work for the Archdiocese, doing a lot of videography for us and everything, and she called out my name. And it's weird when you get called out when there's like thousands and thousands of people milling about. And so she said, "Father, can I interview you?" And they interviewed hundreds and hundreds of priests. And she now works for EWTN instead of the Archdiocese. And so she interviewed me. And one of the things that they asked is they said, "Father, what's a message that you want the youth to hear?" And this is what I told them. This is something that you can do with some of your young kids. I find that it works really well for high school students, by the way. But you ask them this question. You say, "What's next?" And maybe a high school student might say something like this. "Well, I applied to these 3 colleges, but I really want to get into this one. That's what I'm really hoping for." And you're like, "That's great. What's next?" And then you say something like, "Well, I was going to study engineering, I guess, so I hope maybe I get a job as an engineer someday." You're like, "Great. What's next?" You kind of start to see the theme here, right? Now, the youth can wear you down. I know that all too well, but you're going to have the endurance this day, right? You say, "What's next?" "Well, I hope maybe I met somebody and then, we get married and maybe we have some kids." That's great. What's next? But eventually you're going to ask that question so much, they're going to get to the point where they say, "I don't know what's next. I'm super old," right? And then you ask him the all-important question one more time. What's next? But you don't have to leave them hanging. You can give them the answer. The answer is to be with God in heaven. There are so many people in this world that did not know that that's the destination. And if you don't know your destination, what are you by definition? You are lost. Many people are lost, and they need a guide. The other problem, as I see it, is the human person is a body and a soul. Much of the world only nourishes the body in one form or another, and they completely neglect their life of the soul. The reason that we come here to Mass is to nourish the life of the soul. One half of who we are is nourished by the word that we receive in Christ and by the bread of life, by the body and blood of Jesus Christ. So when we look at the world and we see the problems out there, it's actually no longer a mystery. You're like, well, a lot of people are lost and they're half starving, so no wonder things look the way that they look. When I was finishing up at my assignment at St. Cecilia, I was speaking to the 8th grade class one day, and I said, raise your hand if you have Instagram, the app Instagram. And almost everyone in the class raised their hand. And I said, keep your hand up if you follow anything Catholic on Instagram. Everybody's hand went down. When we look at the content we see there, what's the button that we press when we like the content being displayed? Follow, follow, follow. People are following everything but Jesus. That's what a disciple is, a follower of Jesus. So the homework that day was, you must, before you leave this class, type in Catholic, Catholic saint, Catholic churches, and start following something Catholic. So that is on your regular feed, right? Your faith has to feed you. I never thought I was going to be a priest. I didn't think of it as a young man. But my life changed when I finally did this one thing. In the silence of my room, I said, Lord, I want what you want. Instead of presenting all the many blueprints that had failed to the Lord, I finally said to him, I want what you want, Lord. And my life started to radically change. And it changed the people that the Lord used as a mouthpiece was you. That's why you're so important, because I would pray the rosary in the church. I would start going to daily mass. And it was the faithful that came up to me and said, Peter, have you ever thought about being a priest? So consider yourself recruited, by the way. Every time I go to a church, you extend, the office of vocations by being little vocation directors yourselves. And so I need your eyes and your ears in your families, in this very community, in this church, to see men that you think might be capable of that level of holiness and love for the Lord and availability to his people to serve them. And in fact, same goes for consecrated life. If you see a young man or a young woman that has that prayerful disposition, and you can see them praying for the people of God for the rest of their life, say something to them. That's how I knew, because the enemy did everything he could for me to not see it in myself. It was your belief in me that made me realize that the Lord was speaking to me in the first place. There's a big difference between happiness and joy. I said this last night. I said, happiness could be like, gonna get Chipotle for lunch. I don't know, maybe you're looking forward to something that makes you happy, right? But joy is getting drowned by a whole bunch of cold melt water, turning off a valve in the middle of Christmas Day and being freezing cold and being like, this is the happiest I've ever been in my life. The joy penetrates through even suffering and difficulty. Happiness is kind of fleeting. Joy is the penetrating love of Jesus in our life. And so I just ask you to pray for vocations. And it's working. We have 27 wonderful men who are seminarians for the Archdiocese of Portland. And we had 7 new men join the seminary this year. But it doesn't happen without your homes, your families. It doesn't happen without the parishioners here. And it doesn't happen without men heroically saying yes to our Lord Jesus Christ. God bless you all today.